In the hallowed halls of Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio has witnessed the full spectrum of human experience unfold before his bench. Stories of triumph and tragedy, of poor choices and unfortunate circumstances, of people at their lowest moments and occasionally at their most inspiring. But on this cold December morning, just 2 weeks before Christmas, an elderly man would enter his courtroom whose presence would serve as a profound reminder of sacrifice, service, and the precious nature of time itself. His name was Harold Hal Mitchell, and at 82 years old, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been shaped by 8 decades of living, much of it in service to others. Hal's silver hair was neatly combed and parted in the military style he had maintained for over 60 years. His weathered hands showed the calluses and scars of both wartime service and a lifetime of honest work, and his clear blue eyes held the depth that comes from having seen humanity at both its worst and its finest. Judge Caprio immediately noticed something different about Hal as he slowly made his way to the defendant's stand, using a walking cane for support, but maintaining the erect posture that marked him as former military. There was a dignity in his bearing that transcended his current legal troubles, a quiet strength that spoke of someone who had faced far greater challenges than a municipal court citation and had emerged with his character intact. Hal was dressed in his best clothes, a navy blue suit that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained, a crisp white shirt with a tie bearing a small American flag pin, and black dress shoes polished to a mirror shine that reflected decades of military discipline. In his jacket pocket, barely visible, was the corner of what appeared to be a folded American flag, and on his left lapel he wore a small pin that Judge Caprio recognized as a Purple Heart decoration. The citation that had brought Hal to court was relatively minor, a parking violation for leaving his vehicle in a handicapped space for longer than the posted time limit. On paper, it seemed like a straightforward case that could be resolved quickly with either payment of the fine or a brief explanation of circumstances. But Judge Caprio's experienced instincts told him that nothing about Harold Mitchell would be straightforward, and that the story behind his citation would likely reveal depths of human experience that went far beyond simple parking regulations. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Caprio said with his characteristic warmth, immediately sensing that this elderly veteran deserved the full measure of respect and attention that his age and service record commanded. "I see you're here regarding a parking violation at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Before we discuss the specifics of the citation, I want to thank you for your service to our country. Can you tell me which branch of the military you served in?" Hal straightened slightly at the acknowledgement of his military service, his eyes brightening with the pride that veterans feel when their sacrifice is recognized and honored. "Thank you, Your Honor," he replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who had learned to speak with precision and authority during his military years. "I served in the United States Army for 26 years, including 2 tours in Vietnam and 1 in Korea. I retired as a sergeant major in 1985. Judge I." Caprio felt an immediate surge of respect for the man standing before him. A 26-year military career, multiple combat deployments, and retirement at the highest enlisted rank represented a level of service and dedication that few people ever achieved. Harold Mitchell had literally spent the majority of his adult life in uniform, serving his country during some of the most challenging and dangerous periods in modern American history. "That's an impressive record of service, Sergeant Major," Judge Caprio said, using Hal's military title as a gesture of respect for his achievements. "2 tours in Vietnam must have been particularly challenging. I imagine you've seen and experienced things that most of us can't even comprehend." The judge's words acknowledged not just Hal's military service, but the unique burdens that combat veterans carry long after their active duty ends. Hal nodded slowly, his expression taking on the distant look that veterans sometimes get when remembering experiences that are difficult to share with those who haven't lived them. "Vietnam was a difficult time, Your Honor," he said simply, his understatement revealing the kind of emotional restraint that military training instills in people who have faced extreme circumstances. But it was also where I learned about brotherhood, about sacrifice, and about the importance of never leaving anyone behind. Judge Caprio could sense that Hal's reference to never leaving anyone behind carried significance beyond its obvious military context, and he suspected that this principle had continued to guide the veteran's actions long after his retirement from active duty. The values learned in combat often became the foundation for how veterans approached civilian challenges, including the situation that had brought Hal to court today. Sergeant Major, can you tell me about the circumstances that led to your parking citation? Judge Caprio asked gently, understanding that the full context of Hal's situation would be crucial to making a fair and appropriate decision about his case. The citation indicates that you were parked in a handicapped space at the VA Medical Center for longer than the posted time limit. Can you help me understand what happened that day? Hal took a deep breath, gathering himself for what was clearly a difficult topic to discuss. Even at 82, with decades of life experience behind him, there were still subjects that required emotional preparation and careful consideration before he could speak about them openly in a public setting like a courtroom. Your Honor, I was at the VA hospital that day for my regular cancer treatment, Hal began, his words immediately shifting the entire context of his citation from a simple parking violation to something much more serious and personal. I've been battling prostate cancer for the past 3 years, and the treatments require me to spend several hours at the medical center every few weeks. Judge Caprio felt his throat tighten as Hal revealed his ongoing battle with cancer. The image of this elderly veteran who had already given so much in service to his country, now fighting another battle for his very life, added a profound dimension to what had seemed like a routine traffic case. The parking violation suddenly became a minor detail in a much larger story of courage and perseverance. I understand that cancer treatment can be exhausting and time-consuming, Judge Caprio said with genuine compassion, recognizing that Hal's medical situation provided important context for understanding his parking situation. How are you managing? With the treatments? Are you able to drive yourself to appointments, or do you have family members who help you with transportation? The question touched on one of the most difficult aspects of aging and serious illness, the gradual loss of independence that can be particularly challenging for people who have spent their lives being self-reliant and taking care of others. For a man like Hal, who had been a leader and protector throughout his military career, accepting help or acknowledging limitations would be especially difficult. I drive myself to most appointments, Your Honor, Hal replied, his voice carrying the quiet determination of someone who was fighting to maintain his independence despite increasing physical limitations. My wife, Dorothy, passed away 4 years ago, and my children live in other states with families of their own. I try not to burden them with my medical issues unless it's absolutely necessary. The isolation that Hal described was heartbreaking. To Judge Caprio, who could imagine this proud veteran facing cancer treatments alone, navigating complex medical systems without the support of family members, and maintaining his dignity and self-reliance even as his body betrayed him with illness and the inevitable limitations of advanced age. As Hal continued his testimony, Judge Caprio could see the weight of solitude and struggle that this elderly veteran carried with quiet dignity. The courtroom had taken on a reverential quality, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something profound. A man who had spent his life serving others now facing his greatest battle alone, with the same courage and determination that had carried him through decades of military service. The day I received this citation was particularly difficult, Hal explained, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone recounting a painful memory. I had undergone a more intensive treatment than usual, a procedure that the doctors hoped might slow the cancer's progression. The treatment lasted nearly 6 hours, and by the time it was finished, I was exhausted and disoriented from the medication they had given me. Judge Caprio found himself imagining the grueling experience that Hal was describing, An 82-year-old man spending an entire day alone in a medical facility, enduring treatments that would challenge someone half his age with no family, member or friend present to provide comfort or assistance. The isolation and physical strain of such an experience would be overwhelming for anyone, but particularly for someone of Hal's advanced age. I had parked in a handicapped space that morning, which I'm legally entitled to do because of my mobility. Limitations, Hal continued, providing context that Judge Caprio hadn't expected. I have a disabled veteran placard, and normally I'm very careful about the time restrictions. Most handicapped spaces at the VA allow for 3-hour parking, which is usually sufficient for routine appointments. The fact that Hal was legally entitled to use handicapped parking spaces added another layer to his situation. This wasn't a case of someone illegally using accommodations they weren't entitled to, but rather someone who had overstayed the time limit due to circumstances beyond his control. Judge Caprio understood that the distinction was important in assessing both the technical violation and the appropriate response. But this treatment was different from my usual appointments, Hal explained, his words revealing the unpredictable nature of cancer care and the way that medical needs can sometimes conflict with parking regulations designed for routine visits. What was supposed to be a 2-hour procedure turned into an all-day ordeal because my body didn't respond to the treatment the way the doctors expected. Judge Caprio could see the frustration and helplessness in Hal's expression as he described being trapped in a medical situation that extended far beyond his planned time frame. For someone who had spent his military career planning operations and managing logistics, the unpredictability of medical treatment would be particularly challenging to accept and adapt to. During the treatment, I was connected to IV medications that made me drowsy and confused, Hal continued, his clinical description unable to mask the vulnerability he had experienced that day. The nurses explained that this was normal, but it meant that I lost track of time and couldn't think clearly about things like parking meters or time restrictions. I was focused entirely on getting through the treatment and hoping it would help slow the cancer. The medical details that Hal provided painted a picture of someone who had been rendered temporarily incapacitated by necessary treatment, unable to manage the practical details of daily life while his body processed powerful medications designed to fight his disease. Judge Caprio understood that in such circumstances, parking violations became insignificant compared to the struggle for survival that was taking place inside the medical facility. When the treatment finally ended, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was barely able to walk to my car, Hal said, his words revealing the physical toll that the day had taken on him. One of the nurses actually offered to call someone to pick me up because she was concerned about my ability to drive safely, but I told her I would be fine after resting for a few minutes. The pride and determination that Hal had shown in insisting he could drive himself home despite his weakened condition was typical of his generation and his military background, a refusal to accept help even when it might have been the wiser choice. Judge Caprio could see how this same independence and self-reliance might have prevented Hal from asking for assistance with transportation to medical appointments. That's when I discovered the parking citation on my windshield, Hal explained, bringing his story to the immediate cause of his court appearance. I had been parked in that handicapped space for nearly 8 hours, which was obviously much longer than the posted time limit. The citation was for $75, which might not seem like much to some people, but for someone living on a fixed veteran's disability income, it represents a significant expense. Judge Caprio was struck by the cruel irony of Hal's situation, receiving a parking fine while undergoing cancer treatment, being penalized for circumstances that were completely beyond his control, and facing financial hardship as a result of medical care that was supposed to help him. The citation represented yet another burden for someone who was already carrying more than any person should have to bear. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to avoid responsibility for the parking violation, Hal said, his words revealing the integrity and accountability that had defined his character throughout his military service and civilian life. I understand that rules exist for good reasons, and that the time limits on handicapped parking spaces are designed to ensure that these accommodations are available for other people who need them. The moral reasoning that Hal displayed, acknowledging his technical violation while providing context for his circumstances, impressed Judge Caprio with its balance of personal accountability and honest explanation. This was a man who understood the difference between making excuses and providing relevant information that might inform a fair decision. But I also want you to understand that this wasn't a case of carelessness or disregard for parking regulations, Hal continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades taking responsibility for his actions and those of the soldiers under his command. This was a situation where my medical needs and the unpredictable nature of cancer treatment created circumstances that I couldn't have anticipated or prevented. Judge Caprio nodded, understanding that Hal was making a distinction between willful violation of parking rules and circumstances beyond reasonable control. The veteran's careful explanation demonstrated his respect for both the law and the courts. Need to understand the full context of his situation. Your Honor, I've been thinking about this citation for weeks, not just because of the financial burden it represents, but because it's forced me to confront some difficult realities about my situation, Hal said, his words taking on a more personal and emotional tone. At 82, with cancer that's not responding to treatment the way we hoped, I've had to accept that my time may be more limited than I'd like to believe. The shift in Hal's testimony from the specific parking incident to broader reflections on mortality created a profound moment in the courtroom. Judge Caprio could sense that this elderly veteran was preparing to share something deeply personal and significant, something that went far beyond the immediate legal matter that had brought him to court. I've started making arrangements for the end of my life, Hal continued, his matter-of-fact approach to discussing death, revealing the courage and practicality that had served him throughout his military career. I've updated my will, I've arranged for my military funeral, and I've written letters to my children and grandchildren that I want them to have after I'm gone. The preparations that Hal described demonstrated both his military precision in planning and his desire to spare his family from difficult decisions and financial burdens after his death. Judge Caprio was moved by the thoughtfulness and consideration that this elderly veteran was showing for others, even as he faced his own mortality. But this parking citation has become something more than just a legal issue for me, Hal explained, his words revealing the symbolic significance that the citation had taken on in his mind. It's become a reminder of how complicated and difficult life can become when you're old and sick and trying to navigate systems that weren't designed with people like me in mind. As Hal spoke about navigating systems not designed for people like him, Judge Caprio could see a profound sadness in the elderly veteran's eyes. Not self-pity, but a deep weariness that came from someone who had served his country faithfully for decades only to find himself struggling with bureaucratic obstacles and institutional indifference in his final years. The courtroom had become completely silent, as everyone present recognized they were witnessing something far more significant than a parking violation hearing. Your Honor, I've been thinking a lot lately about the differences between the young man who enlisted in the Army 64 years ago and the old man standing before you today, Hal said, his voice taking on the reflective quality of someone looking back across decades of experience. That young soldier believed that if you served your country with honor, if you did your duty and sacrificed for something bigger than yourself, the country would take care of you when you were old and needed help. Judge Caprio felt his heart constrict as Hal articulated what was clearly a profound disappointment with how society treated its aging veterans. The gap between the promises made to young soldiers and the reality faced by elderly veterans was a national tragedy that played out in individual stories like Hal's, where men and women who had given their best years to military service found themselves alone and struggling in their final chapters. I'm not bitter about it, Hal continued, his words revealing the grace and dignity that had sustained him through decades of challenges. I knew when I signed up that military service involved sacrifice And I made those sacrifices willingly because I believed in something larger than my own comfort or convenience. But I have to admit that I'm saddened by how difficult it's become for veterans my age to access the care and support we were promised. The distinction that Hal made between bitterness and sadness revealed the emotional maturity and wisdom that had developed over 8 decades of living. He wasn't angry about his circumstances, but he was deeply disappointed in systems that had failed to live up to their obligations to the people who had served them most faithfully. The VA hospital where I receive my cancer treatment is understaffed and overwhelmed, Hal explained, providing context for the extended treatment time that had led to his parking citation. The doctors and nurses are dedicated professionals who do their best, but they're working with limited resources and impossible caseloads. What used to be 2-hour appointments now regularly stretch into all-day ordeals because there simply aren't enough staff to handle the number of aging veterans who need care. Judge Caprio understood that Hal was describing a systemic problem that went far beyond individual cases or isolated incidents. The aging of the veteran population, combined with limited healthcare resources, was creating exactly the kind of impossible situations that had led to Hal's parking violation. Circumstances where people were forced to choose between following regulations and accessing necessary medical care. I see other veterans my age in the waiting rooms and treatment areas, Hal continued, his voice taking on the protective tone that sergeants use when describing soldiers under their care. Men and women who served their country with distinction, who sacrificed their youth and their health for principles they believed in, now struggling with complicated medical appointments, transportation difficulties, and financial hardship that makes every aspect of their lives more challenging. The broader perspective that Hal provided revealed his continued sense of responsibility for fellow veterans, even in his own time of need. Judge Caprio could see that despite his personal struggles, Hal remained focused on the welfare of others who shared his experiences and challenges. Your Honor, I want to tell you about something that happened during my last treatment that really affected me, Hal said, his voice taking on the tone of someone preparing to share a story that held particular significance. While I was waiting for my medication to finish, I met a veteran named Robert who served 2 tours in Afghanistan. He's only 35 years old, but he's already dealing with medical issues that will affect him for the rest of his life. Judge Caprio leaned forward, sensing that Hal was about to share an encounter that had particular meaning for him and that might reveal something important about his perspective on service, sacrifice, and the connections between veterans across different generations and conflicts. Robert was there for treatment related to injuries he sustained from an IED explosion, Hal continued, his words revealing the ongoing physical and psychological toll that modern warfare takes on service members, long after their deployments end. He told me that he sometimes feels forgotten by the very country he served, that civilians don't understand what veterans go through, and that he worries about growing old with disabilities that make every day a struggle. The intergenerational conversation that Hal described between himself and the younger veteran highlighted the shared experiences that connected military service members across different wars and different eras. Despite the decades that separated their service, both men faced similar challenges in accessing care, managing disabilities, and finding their place in a civilian society that often failed to understand their sacrifice. I spent several hours talking with Robert about service, about sacrifice, and about what it means to find purpose when your body can no longer do what your heart wants to accomplish, Hal explained, his words revealing the mentorship and wisdom sharing that often occurred between veterans of different generations. I told him something that I want to share with you today because I think it's important for people to understand. Judge Caprio could sense that Hal was approaching something significant in his testimony, a message or lesson that had emerged from his decades of experience and his current battle with mortality. The elderly veteran's careful build-up suggested that whatever he was about to share held particular importance for him and represented wisdom earned through a lifetime of service and struggle. I told Robert that the most important thing I've Learned in 82 years of living is that hope isn't about believing that everything will turn out the way you want it to, Hal said, his words carrying the weight of profound personal insight. Hope is about believing that whatever time you have left, whatever challenges you face, you can still find ways to serve others and make a positive difference in the world. The definition of hope that Hal provided was remarkable in its maturity and wisdom, revealing someone who had learned to find meaning and purpose even in the face of terminal illness and personal struggle. Judge Caprio understood that this perspective had been earned through decades of facing adversity with courage and grace. I've been volunteering at the VA hospital whenever I'm feeling well enough, Hal continued, revealing how he was putting his philosophy into practice despite his own health challenges. I help other veterans navigate the appointment systems, I sit with people who are going through treatment alone, and I share what I've learned about managing cancer and dealing with the fear that comes with a terminal diagnosis. The selflessness that Hal demonstrated in using his own difficult experiences to help other veterans was extraordinary to Judge Caprio. Here was a man facing his own mortality, dealing with painful treatments and financial struggles, who was still finding ways to serve others and contribute to his community. Your Honor, the reason I'm sharing all of this with you is because I want you to understand that this parking citation represents more than just a technical violation, Hal explained, bringing his broader reflections back to the specific legal matter that had brought him to court. It represents the daily challenges that aging veterans face when trying to access the care we've earned through our service, and the way that well-intentioned regulations can sometimes create additional hardships for people who are already struggling. Judge Caprio could see that Hal was approaching something deeply significant in his testimony, and the elderly veteran's careful, measured delivery suggested that he was preparing to share thoughts that he had been contemplating for some time. The courtroom had taken on an almost sacred atmosphere, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness something that transcended the usual boundaries of legal proceedings and entered the realm of profound human wisdom. Your Honor, I need to tell you something that I haven't shared with many people, Hal said, his voice taking on the solemn tone of someone preparing to reveal something deeply personal and important. My doctors have told me that the cancer treatments aren't working as well as they had hoped, and that I probably have somewhere between 3 and 6 months left to live. The stark reality of Hal's prognosis hit Judge Caprio like a physical blow. Here was a man facing the end of his life with the same dignity and courage he had displayed throughout his military career, standing in a municipal courtroom discussing a parking citation while carrying the knowledge that his time was measured in weeks rather than years. I'm telling you this not to gain sympathy or to avoid responsibility for the parking violation, Hal continued, his words revealing the integrity that had defined his character throughout his life. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that when you're facing the end of your life, certain things become very clear about what matters and what doesn't matter, about what's worth fighting for and what's worth letting go. Judge Caprio felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he listened to Hal's matter-of-fact discussion of his own mortality. The elderly veteran's ability to speak so calmly about death while maintaining focus on serving others and contributing positively to the world was a testament to both his military training and his fundamental character. In my remaining time, I want to accomplish 3 things, Hal said, his voice growing stronger as he articulated goals that had clearly given his final months structure and purpose. First, I want to continue helping other veterans at the VA hospital for as long as I'm physically able. Second, I want to finish writing letters to my grandchildren that they can read when they're older. Letters that will help them understand what military service means and why their grandfather was proud to wear the uniform. The legacy projects that Hal described revealed someone who was using his final months not just to prepare for death, but to ensure that his values, experiences, and wisdom would continue to influence others long after he was gone. Judge Caprio was moved by the thoughtfulness and generosity that motivated Hal's final activities. And third, Hal continued, his voice taking on an emotional intensity that commanded everyone's complete attention, I want to find ways to help. People understand that veterans don't serve for recognition or reward. We serve because we believe in something bigger than ourselves, and that belief doesn't end when we take off the uniform for the last time. The mission that Hal had set for himself in his final months was remarkable in its scope and ambition. Despite facing terminal illness, financial struggles, and the daily challenges of aging, he remained focused on education, service, and advocacy for causes that transcended his personal circumstances. Your Honor, I want to share with you the words that I've been saying to young veterans like Robert when they tell me they feel forgotten or discouraged, Hal said, preparing to deliver what Judge Caprio sensed would be the emotional heart of his testimony. These are words that I hope might help other people understand what service really means, long after I'm no longer here to say them myself. Judge Caprio leaned forward, understanding that he was about to hear something that Hal considered his final message to the world, words that had been distilled from 8 decades of living and refined through the clarity that comes with facing one's own mortality. I tell them that every person who has ever worn a military uniform has made a promise to something greater than themselves. Hal began, his voice taking on the authority and conviction of someone speaking truth earned through personal experience. We promise to protect people we've never met, to defend ideals we might never see fully realized, and to sacrifice our own comfort and safety for the possibility that future generations might live in a better world. The definition of military service that Hal provided was both simple and profound, capturing the essential selflessness that motivated people to volunteer for dangerous duty in service of abstract principles and unknown beneficiaries. Judge Caprio could see that these words represented the culmination of a lifetime's reflection on the meaning and value of service. I tell them that no one can take that promise away from us, no matter how we're treated by bureaucratic systems, or how forgotten we might feel by a society that's moved on from the conflicts we fought. Hal continued, his words carrying the power of someone who had found peace with his own service despite the challenges he faced in his final years. The promise we made was between us and something eternal. The idea that freedom is worth defending, that democracy is worth preserving, and that future generations deserve the chance to live in peace. The spiritual dimension that Hal brought to his understanding of military service elevated his message beyond political or social commentary and into the realm of fundamental human values. Judge Caprio understood that this elderly veteran was articulating something that transcended specific wars or policies and touched on the basic human capacity for self-sacrifice in service of others. And I tell them that when their time comes to leave this world, they can do so, knowing that they answered the call when their country needed them. Hal said, his voice beginning to break with emotion as he approached the conclusion of his message. They can know that they stood up when others sat down, that they stepped forward when others stepped back, and that they chose service over comfort, duty over convenience, and sacrifice over safety. The imagery that Hal used, standing up when others sat down, stepping forward when others stepped back, created a powerful picture of moral courage that extended far beyond military service and into all areas of human behavior where individuals must choose between self-interest and service to others. Your Honor, these are the words I want to be remembered for, Hal said, looking directly at Judge Caprio with eyes that held both profound sadness and unshakable hope. Not the parking citation that brought me here today, not the cancer that's taking my life, not the struggles I've faced as an aging veteran trying to navigate systems that weren't designed for people like me. The legacy that Hal was choosing for himself, to be remembered for words of encouragement and hope rather than for his troubles and challenges, revealed the fundamental optimism and generosity of spirit that had sustained him through decades of service and sacrifice. I want to be remembered as someone who believed until his last breath that service matters, that sacrifice has meaning, that every person who chooses to put others before themselves makes the world a little bit better. Hal continued, his words taking on the quality of a final testament. And I want young veterans to know that their service connects them to something eternal, something that will outlast any individual life or any particular conflict. Judge Caprio could see that Hal was pouring everything he had learned, everything he believed and everything he hoped for, into these final words. The elderly veteran was using his court appearance not just to address his parking citation, but to deliver a message that he clearly viewed as his final gift to his fellow veterans, and to society as a whole. Judge Caprio sat in complete silence for what felt like an eternity after Hal finished speaking, the elderly veteran's words hanging in the courtroom air like a benediction that had touched every soul present. In 30 years of presiding over, Municipal Court Judge Caprio had never been more profoundly moved or more acutely aware that he was in the presence of someone truly extraordinary, a man whose final months were being spent not in self-pity or fear, but in service to others and devotion to ideals that transcended his own mortality. When Judge Caprio finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion that he made no attempt to control or hide. Tears were streaming down his face as he looked at Hal with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred encounters. "Sergeant Major Mitchell," he said, using Hal's military title with the deepest respect, "I need you to know that in 3 decades of serving as a judge, no one has ever honored my courtroom the way you have honored it today with your presence and your words." Hal straightened slightly at Judge Caprio's words, his military bearing reasserting itself in response to the recognition and respect being shown by someone in authority. But Judge Caprio could also see tears forming in the elderly veteran's eyes, suggesting that such acknowledgement and validation had been all too rare in his recent experiences with civilian institutions. "What you have shared with us today transcends any legal matter that could ever come before this court," Judge Caprio continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that he had just witnessed something that would change him forever. "You have given us a master class in courage, in service, in dignity, and in the kind of hope that can only come from a life lived in service to others." Judge Caprio stood up from his chair, a gesture of respect that surprised everyone in the courtroom but felt completely appropriate given the magnitude of what they had all just experienced. Walking around his desk to stand directly in front of Hal, the judge extended his hand in a gesture that bridged the formal distance between judicial authority and human recognition. "Sergeant Major, this citation is hereby dismissed in its entirety," Judge Caprio announced, his voice ringing with the kind of moral authority that transforms legal proceedings into moments of justice in its truest sense. "Not only will you not pay 1 penny of this fine, but I want to formally apologize to you on behalf of any system that has ever made your life more difficult when it should have been making it easier." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, something that rarely happened in Judge Caprio's proceedings, but felt entirely appropriate given the extraordinary circumstances of Hal's testimony. Even the court staff, who had seen countless cases over the years, were openly crying as they witnessed this moment of perfect justice and human recognition. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Taking Hal's weathered hand in both of his own, he looked directly into the elderly veteran's eyes with an intensity that conveyed profound respect and genuine affection. "Sergeant Major, I want you to know that your words today will not be forgotten. They will not end in this courtroom. I am going to make sure that what you've shared with us reaches people who need to hear it. Young veterans, families of service members, and anyone who has ever questioned whether their sacrifices matter." Hal's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude as he realized that Judge Caprio was promising to amplify his message far beyond the walls of the municipal courthouse. For a man who had been feeling forgotten and overlooked, the promise that his words would reach others who needed encouragement was perhaps the greatest gift he could have received. "Furthermore," Judge Caprio continued, his voice taking on the determined tone of someone making a commitment that would extend far beyond this single interaction, "I want to give you my personal contact information. If you ever need help navigating the VA system, if you ever need someone to advocate for you or other veterans, if you ever just need someone to listen, I want you to call me directly." The offer was extraordinary in its personal nature and its recognition that Hal's value extended far beyond his ability to pay parking fines or comply with municipal regulations. Judge Caprio was essentially adopting this elderly veteran as part of his extended family, creating a support system that acknowledged both Hal's worth as a human being and his unique contributions to society. "Your Honor," Hal said, his voice breaking with emotion as he struggled to respond to the unexpected kindness and recognition he was receiving. "You have given me something today that I thought I had lost. The feeling that my service mattered, that my sacrifices meant something, and that the country I love still has room for the values I've tried to live by." Judge Caprio felt his own heart breaking as he heard the gratitude in Hal's voice, and realized how long this proud veteran had been carrying feelings of abandonment and insignificance. The simple act of listening, acknowledging, and responding with compassion had restored something essential to Hal's sense of self-worth and purpose. "Sergeant Major, your service didn't just matter, it was essential," Judge Caprio said, with the conviction of someone who truly understood the debt that civilian society owed to people like Hal. "Every freedom we enjoy, every peaceful night's sleep we experience, every opportunity we have to pursue our dreams, all of it was paid for by people like you who were willing to sacrifice everything to protect something bigger than themselves." The validation that Judge Caprio provided went beyond mere courtesy or politeness and into the realm of genuine recognition of Hal's contributions to society. For someone who had been feeling forgotten and undervalued, hearing such words from a respected authority figure was profoundly healing and restorative. "Before you leave here today," Judge Caprio said, reaching into his own wallet, "I want to give you something." He pulled out $200 and pressed it into Hal's hands, despite the veteran's protests. "This isn't charity, and it isn't pity. This is a small token of gratitude from one American to another, from someone whose freedom was protected by your service to someone who earned that protection through decades of sacrifice." Hal looked down at the money with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, not because of the financial assistance, though it would certainly help with his medical expenses, but because of what the gesture represented: recognition, respect, and genuine care from someone who understood the value of his service. "Your Honor," Hal said, his voice steady despite his tears, "I came here today expecting to pay a fine and maybe explain my circumstances. I never expected to find someone who would listen to my story with such compassion or who would understand that veterans like me still have something to contribute even when our bodies are failing us." Judge Caprio nodded, understanding that Hal's gratitude went far beyond the practical assistance he had received and touched on something much deeper: the human need to be seen, heard, and valued for who we are and what we've contributed to the world. "Sergeant Major, I want you to promise me something," Judge Caprio said, his voice taking on the tone of someone making a request that carried significant importance. "I want you to promise that you'll continue sharing your message of hope with other veterans for as long as you're able. Your words have the power to heal wounds that no medical treatment can address, and there are countless veterans who need to hear what you've shared with us today." Hal straightened to his full height, his military posture reasserting itself as he prepared to accept what felt like a final mission from someone he had come to respect deeply. "I promise, Your Honor," he said with the same conviction he had once used to accept military orders. "I promise to use whatever time I have left to help other veterans understand that their service has meaning, that their sacrifices matter, and that they are not forgotten." As Hal prepared to leave the courtroom that day, he turned back one final time to address Judge Caprio and everyone present. "Your Honor, you asked me to share words of hope, and I've tried to do that. But I want you to know that today, you've given me something I didn't expect to find again. Hope for myself. Hope that there are still people who understand what service means who recognize sacrifice when they see it, and who will ensure that the values we fought for continue to matter long after we're gone. The courtroom remained silent as Hal slowly made his way to the exit, his walking cane tapping rhythmically on the floor as he carried himself with the dignity and purpose that had defined his entire adult life. Everyone present understood they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a legal proceeding, but a profound moment of human connection that had transformed both the judge and the veteran who had come seeking justice and found something far more valuable: recognition, respect, and the assurance that his life's work had meaning that would endure long after his final breath. Judge Caprio would carry Hal's words with him for the rest of his career, using them to remind himself why compassion and understanding were just as important as legal knowledge in administering justice. And Hal would spend his remaining months knowing that his message of hope had found its way into the world through someone who understood its importance and would ensure that it reached the people who needed to hear it most. The story of Harold Mitchell's final words would go on to inspire countless veterans, comfort grieving families, and remind an entire nation that the true measure of a life well lived isn't found in wealth or fame, but in service to others and devotion to principles that outlast any individual existence. In his final months, this 82-year-old veteran had accomplished something remarkable. He had transformed a municipal courtroom into a place where hope could flourish, where service could be honored, and where the human spirit could triumph over the inevitable challenges of mortality, illness, and the passage of time.